scientifically, the push is literally, can we find the link between those two ideas? Can we find the link between the macroscopic and the microscopic, between the finite and the infinite? General relativity and quantum mechanics is the main scientific push, and they call that the theory of everything. Can we find the theory of everything? Can we find the link between those two giant bodies of knowledge, the quantum physics and general relativity, because they don't have a link between them, and then they're coming up with all these different theories. And the link between them, the best way for you to think about it is that you want to find a language translation between the two of them. You want to find a language translation between the macroscopic and the microscopic, or between the infinite and the finite, or general relativity and quantum mechanics. You want to find the language translation between them, because the language translation will tell you truth with regard to both languages. If you know what the translation is, if you're able to mark out a translation, or whatever it is that includes both of them, because the translation between those two languages will be between the both of them in the middle somewhere. And so I would say the theory of everything is just one, is the number one. The number one is the theory of everything, ultimately. And that's a good philosophical answer. It's not practically what scientists are looking for, but at least you could put that as the midway point between the two of those, between finiteness and infiniteness, and between the microscopic and the macroscopic, and between a world that is undefinable and the world that is definable. It's just the number one, or the individual, or the border of the individual. It's the border between the subjective and the objective, which somehow links both realities, which is very similar, at least with regard to subjectivity and objectivity, is like the point at which you speak words and they come out of your mouth. The point that your subjective reality meets is taking part in the objective reality. So it's kind of just like the border of that you exist and then are able to be defined by other people, that you do actions that other people can see. Like when you perform an action that ultimately stems from your mind, or is something that you wanted to do, or is a product of your, like something you would do genetically, any action that you would perform, or anything that you say, any sentence that comes out of your mouth comes from your subjective mind, and then is evidenced in reality for other people to see, and then is part of the objective reality. And so so the description is like, what do you say is between subjectivity and objectivity? If it's this like boundary, this border sort of thing that we cross all the time. It's a border that we cross when we speak. We enter the objective reality from the subjective reality, and we obtain information from the objective reality around us, and then transfer that into our subjective reality. And it's really like we translate it into our own language, where our own language is predicated on the categories and definitions we've created in our mind to organize language, because everybody organizes it differently, and everybody, like, the definitions that they have for things are built around a different set of manifestations of the thing that's being defined. And so it's sort of like a translation of language between the objective and you translate it into something that is digestible for you yourself. But it's one. The reason that the link between finite and infinite is one, and between subjectivity and objectivity is one, because subjectivity ends at one and then begins at higher numbers than that. Because beyond subjectivity, like you as an individual, whatever you're an individual of, like you're an individual human, you're a human, at the point that you are not just considering the space that is you yourself subjectively, you're considering other humans. And so then you can count numbers higher than one. And the finite involves counting, and it involves It involves counting, but it still includes the number one, because the finite begins at one. The finite begins at one, and the infinite ends at one. The subjective ends at one, and the objective begins at one. The objective begins at one, frequency begins at one, a whole undivided unit of anything begins at one. Anything you can count, or like a manifestation of an idea like peace, like manifestations of peace, there you can count those. You can count manifestations of anger. You can but yes. Yeah. Enough. Bye. No, I'm not done talking about it. So you can count manifestations of peace or anger or whatever, and you can start to count them beyond one thing. Anything that you can count is one and over. You can't count less than one. You can't count zero. You can't count zero. And it's a different thing to describe. Yeah. Can't count less than one, and you can't count zero. And you can't count fractional amounts the same way. Like you can't count whole undivided things that you can define. Definition begins at one, and then undefinition ends at one, or is contained within one. It's contained within a space 0 to 1, like the infinite. And so I'm saying that the infinite ultimately, like the easiest way for you to describe it to yourself is as a space between 0 and 1, but like a spectrum ends at 1, and it contains a space 0 to 1, and then the finite begins at 1. And so your link between the microscopic and the macroscopic is the only thing that includes both of those, that is intersectional of both of them, and is a superposition of both of them, the same in a similar way that the past is a superposition of the future at the present. In the one is at one. One is the superposition of finite and infinite. It's where the finite is equal to the infinite, because one contains both of those.